You're listening to Just Medicine, an equity in healthcare podcast created by medical students in British Columbia.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. My name is Sandra Smiley, and I use she, her pronouns. I am a settler of Irish, English, and Scots descent, and a final year medical student at the University of British Columbia, coming to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. 10 years ago in June, 94 calls to action were issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The 94 calls are intended to address and redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the land colonially known as Canada. Recognizing the importance of health in the broader project of reconciliation, the TRC made 7 calls that relate specifically to health. But Indigenous peoples across this country continue to experience health inequities and face challenges accessing culturally safe care. Although the TRC's calls to action are primarily addressed at governments and decision makers, health professionals also have a role to play in responding to those calls. I was grateful to share the mic with Derek Thompson, Director of Indigenous Engagement at the University of British Columbia's Faculty of Medicine, to talk more about how non-Indigenous medical learners can participate in the essential work of reconciliation. As a heads up, parts of our discussion touched on difficult topics like residential schools, so please bear this in mind and take care of yourselves. Here's our conversation.
Good morning. Good to be here. My name is Derek Thompson. My ancestral name is Bookwilla, and I am from a remote-ish community called Ditidaht, and we're one of 14 Nuu-chah-nulth communities along the west coast of Vancouver Island. My parents are Charlie and Maud Thompson. My paternal grandparents were Webster and Ida Thompson. My grandmother was Ida Modeste from Cowichan Tribes, and my maternal grandparents were Micah and Irene Shaw from Kitimat up at the head of Douglas Channel in northern BC. And my grandmother was Irene Larson from Bella Bella. So I have lineage in all of those nations. I am one of 4 seated hereditary chiefs in my community, along with Arnold Shaw, Paul Tate, and Jamie Johnson. So if you think about the distinct relationship between the earth and the moon, not in terms of just its gravitational pull and the effects of tides and all those things, but more specifically, it's the moon's effect physiologically on women, particularly in regards to their menstrual cycle. And so to be very rudimentary about it, amongst Nuu-chah-nulth people, we have a long-standing hierarchy that not only applied to the paternalistic side of things, but also the maternalistic side of things. So a chief, a Čaabať is what we call them, a hereditary chief, could only marry a woman with equal or more chiefly status. So we operated on both the male and female in that hierarchy. So arguably, women at the top of that hierarchy had more power because they entered into that marriage with equal and more often with more status, meaning rights to land and its resources, chiefly names and titles, so on and so forth. And within that hierarchy, I guess we have the equivalent of princes and princesses that were direct lineage to our chiefs. And just below them were people that were assigned important chiefly things, like people who hunted whales, created songs, created totem poles, built big houses, those kinds of people that carried out the directives of our chiefs. And then right below them were just common people, and right on the bottom of that hierarchy were we owned and traded slaves. So in Nuu-chah-nulth hierarchy, say unlike Cree people, you could only ever be born into that lineage. There's no way to advance into it. There's no way to move out of it. You will forever be in that lineage and be a chief. So Cree people, it's based on merit. You can be born a nobody and over time become somebody through your accomplishments. So my point being in regards to Bookwilla, one of the most important things our Nuu-chah-nulth chiefs do, if you consider all of the things a chief can do in our potlatch system, in our cultural and ceremonial work, the biggest thing we can do is to acknowledge and celebrate the exact moment a girl becomes a woman, and in a very public way honor the ability for women to bring life into the world. So that relationship that women have, only women have with our moon, is pretty incredible in that it lended a rich value system that afforded us the ability to figure out ways and ceremonies to acknowledge our relationship to women and to uphold that relationship amongst Nuu-chah-nulth people. So that is Bookwilla. So I always think that's an amazing thing that we often talk about our ancestral names, our Indian names, and spend very little time actually talking about what they mean and the purpose they serve in our community. So that's a little bit about who I am and where I'm from. I am currently the Director for Indigenous Engagement with the UBC Faculty of Medicine, and I started off three plus years ago in the Office of Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion as the Indigenous Advisor. And prior to that, I was the Director of Health for Suhiltun Health Center with Cowichan Tribes for about 6.5 years, and then have spent the better part of 30 years only ever working in a First Nations community or organization prior to coming here. So the little bit of unique experience and perspective I bring into the commitments made by the Faculty of Medicine to Truth and Reconciliation, particularly from a First Nations perspective. So.
Thank you, Derek, for offering us that window into who you are and who your people are. What we're doing today is talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and the 94 calls to action and what role medical learners and trainees can have in pushing those asks forward, particularly the 7 that pertain to health. Just to start us off, it would be good to do a bit of a state of play. I'd love to hear how you feel that Canada is doing on the 94 calls to action, particularly those that pertain to health. There was this report that was put out by the First Nations Health Authority here in what is colonially known as British Columbia. That was an update of a population health survey that they had conducted 5 years ago. And it found that although there was some progress on certain indicators, there was backsliding or stagnation on several other indicators with respect to the health of Indigenous people in what's colonially known as British Columbia. And Dr. Bonnie Henry said, while relaying the findings of this report, that supportive systems, and I quote, such as health, education, and housing, must honor and uplift First Nations ways of knowing and being. And it's clear from the data that our systems are not meeting these obligations to First Nations people in BC. How do you see that?
I would agree. I've not read the report, but there are other reports prior to that say almost exactly the same thing, right? We've been at this work for quite some time in recent decades. If you're traveling backwards in time, you ultimately quickly realize, there's been no policy for Indigenous peoples at all when it comes to health systems, academic systems, justice systems, education systems, other systems. So the very first semblance of Indian health policy in this country was in 1979. I was 11 years old in 1979. So in my lifetime, so if you think about 1980 to 1990, There was quite literally no community health service programs in our community. There were no primary care clinics in our community. There were no specialty-related health services in our community. So in a very basic sense, Canadians got hospitals and a healthcare system. We got Indian hospitals. Canadians got free public education and top-notch universities. We got Indian residential schools. Canadians got free land and the resources within it. We got Indian reserves. Canadians were afforded the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to practice their cultures. We got the potlatch ban, which outlawed our culture and our language for 72 years in this country. We weren't allowed to leave Indian reserves. We weren't allowed to vote. When our Indian woman married a white guy, she lost her Indian status. There's just a complete legacy in this country that was hell-bent on getting rid of us. So Nathan Rutstein famously said something like, prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance. I was just a teenager when I first heard that. I was too young and naive to kind of feel, well, I don't know what that means. And as I matured-ish over the years, I've always revisited that statement and thought, oh, well, if your prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance, I've learned since that ignorance, naivete, is a tool of colonialism. Colonizers use it, and I hear it a lot even now in the work that I hear in UBC when I'm presenting. A lot of people say to me, "Oh, I didn't know about Indian residential schools. I didn't know about Indian reserves. I didn't know." To which I aptly reply, well, you know now. So what are you going to do now? Right? So if your prejudice is an emotional commitment to ignorance, then what is sustained ignorance? Well, they become beliefs. So I think that's what Bonnie Henry references and other people in power positions like that. You're absolutely right. Systems do need to shift. And they do need to come to terms with the ignorance, the naivete. In fact, when Joyce Echaquan died, right, in Quebec, this poor woman died of a congenital heart disease. So wasn't drunk, wasn't high on drugs, but had just the amazing sensibility to record, while she's dying, recording these racist slurs that would be thrown at her by the attending RNs in the emergency room. And the nurse, I watched a segment of it, and it's just disturbing to watch, but the nurse said, you should be ashamed of yourself. What are your kids going to think of you, right? And in the inquiry of Joyce Echaquan's death, that nurse was on the stand, and her first tool was ignorance. I didn't know she had congenital heart disease. Well, isn't that your job to know? So that moment, Joyce Echaquan's death, there's a literal cost to your emotional commitment to being ignorant. There's life and death cost associated. So we see this across all systems: judicial, educational, health, policing, where just alarming rates of not only are people facing nasty instances of racism and discrimination, but that lead to death. So we've known this experience for quite a long time because we've not been included in the revision, the so-called processes to include us in the so-called transformational kind of changes that are happening in healthcare systems. What's urgent in an era of truth and reconciliation is to start including us. If you're going to live up to the commitments around TRC, then we need to be a part of not just the conversation. Don't just invite me to do your land acknowledgement. Don't just invite an elder to make you feel good. Get us at the table. Give us a mandate. Give us some autonomy. Give us some authority. And let us be a part of that transformational shift in those various systems.
Thank you for bringing up the Indian hospitals and Joyce's story, because I think that's a really important part of this conversation, the fact that the healthcare system has been so instrumental in the oppression of the Indigenous peoples of this land. And I don't know about you, but I feel like that places even greater importance on doing this work for people in the healthcare system. As we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, this podcast is intended for medical learners and trainees who are at the very bottom of this really rigid hierarchy. And so sometimes it can feel like we don't have a whole lot of wiggle room, we don't have a whole lot of influence. But at the same time, we are the people who are doing the service of the healthcare system. We are the people who are most frequently interfacing with patients, are most often, I guess, spend the most time interfacing with patients. So we really are the system. And in a way, that gives us a lot of influence, in fact, to do some of this kind of transformational work that you were describing outside of the bounds of those slow bureaucratic processes. So I'm wondering, how do you see medical learners having these really privileged, the privilege of these interactions? How do you see their role in pushing forward some of the TRC's calls to action?
Yeah, that's a really important and timely question. You reference, I think, what is an important point and way to start is that it is a privilege, right? I've recently been brought into the processes to plan for the UBC Faculty of Medicine's events to acknowledge 70 to 75 years of excellence, they're calling it. So in 1950, the Faculty of Medicine started, and for 75 years has been operating as one, and now is one of the best medical programs in the world. So I was brought into the conversation about what do you think is important to include as part of that acknowledgement of 75 years of excellence. And I said, well, I think for me, 1950, all of the Indian residential schools in this province were still in operation. Both my parents, of which were at Dale Burney Indian Residential School during that time period. So I think it's important to celebrate. Yeah, by all means, celebrate. You need to celebrate these milestones. But you also need to be honest, because 3 years ago, the Faculty of Medicine made a formal apology for their role in the oppression and assimilation of First Nations in this province and Indigenous peoples across the country. So it's important to consider and reflect on those historical contexts in the last 75 years, because I told the planning people that apology is within that 75-year time frame. It's equally important not only to reflect on what we've done in the last 75 years, but what can we do better over the next 75 years, and to really be cognizant that these processes, these commitments, these apologies, they're not just aesthetic in nature, but they're actually anchored to something real, and that is that in our chosen professions and careers, there's an obvious need and urgency to course correct the way we engage with Indigenous patients in any part of any healthcare system. So it's important as a medical learner, especially as you referenced, the numbers of people that make up the hierarchy, create an individual will to figure out their part in the work. And if we have enough individuals then it becomes shared. It becomes a shared energy. So let's create a new energy that is intent and deliberate, and filled with all of the principles, be it personal or professional, that create a strong enough foundation where we can be collective enough of mind and heart to really get at the work that we call truth and reconciliation. I was living and working in Saskatoon for a number of years, and I went to university at the University of Saskatchewan, and I had an elective course in Eastern Studies. So there was this professor from Oxford University that came in and spoke on campus. At the end of his seminar, he was talking about the colonial relationship between Britain and India and that long-standing tension. They were in this country for 400 some years, and they left India in a mess kind of thing. So he was talking about reconciliation in that context, about these two warring parties are now coming together to try and figure out the relationship. But he said something I thought was pretty unique given his academic stature in the international community. He was hypothesizing these very complex academic constructs, and at the end he just boiled it down to, we just need to find a way to love each other better. We need to act on our love for and towards each other. Teach our children to love. And that's pretty incredible. To me, it was. I thought that's pretty. You have these highly complex ideas, and it comes down to just, if you just talk to each other, if you just get to know one another, if you just love each other. So I was listening to CBC Radio recently with Nala Ayed, the program Ideas. It reminded me when Paul Kennedy was the host of Ideas. He had a regular segment on Ideas called The Art of a Conversation. And Nala Ayed is bringing that guy in to talk about the need to really get at how do we talk to people. And in this day and age, with all that's going on in the world, what's really missing and absent and needed is for us to really talk to each other, to really get to know each other, and to really understand where those principles align. You could forever and a day talk about where your principles don't align. You'll always find something wrong. But we don't spend enough time talking about where do we share principles that align with one another, and what are the ethics? How do we govern the way we behave towards one another with those very beliefs? So, I would say that to anybody who wants to learn that significant transformative change in your personal life is only ever going to come out if you exercise, if you use the analogy of your oblique muscle to this work, right? You never know you have an oblique muscle until you exercise it, because you wake up sore the next day, right? So it's very similar that if you don't exercise that ability to talk about these things, even though you may not understand them or you might get it wrong, you'll never know the benefit of becoming healthy with that muscle. And the more often you exercise it and put it to use and figure it out, the stronger it becomes. So I think there's a real goodness in talking about these things, and there are many people that I engage with in this job that don't do that. That's the real work. How do you take this? If you've been inspired and moved in some way, take it somewhere. Pick up a book. There's a real need, urgency, and goodness to figure out, as you've described, the individual people who make up those very systems. And if we can get there, I think there's a lot of goodness in that.
I love that. Let's recap the quote. It's, we need to learn how to love each other.
Yeah.
I love that. I think this is a direct quote from the late Senator Murray Sinclair. But in any case, one of the underpinning themes of his career was love.
Yeah.
Was love for others, even when others don't love us back. And that being a cornerstone of some of this transformational work that Canada must undertake. So I really like that as a practical tool for use in clinical medicine. Care for other people, respect, and be warm to other people, even if those sentiments aren't returned. I think that's really great and practical advice.
Well, I think especially for Indigenous peoples, when I think about that, I think about my mom. My mom was shipped off to the St. Michael's Indian Residential School in Alert Bay when she was 4 years old. And then when she was 8, she was shipped off to the Alberni Indian Residential School. And she was there till she was about 16, and then less than a year later, she gave birth to me. So my mom is one of the most amazing, beautiful people that I've always held in high regard and respect. Of course, she's my mom. I'm going to say that, but you can look at her for 100 years and never know her story, her history. My mom, in recent years, has gone through some health-related issues, her hip, her knee, thyroid, all that kind of stuff. And I've been her advocate, whether it's her family doc or emergency or wherever. Otherwise, she wouldn't go. And like a lot of our people, they'll choose ill health over the potential of facing some kind of racism or prejudice or discrimination in those health systems. When she first started out in dealing with some of her health issues, she would say only to me that she doesn't like to be touched. She doesn't like physically handled, especially by white people, because of that largely unresolved trauma. So you could look at my mom for 100 years and never know who she is and what she's carrying, right? And it's not her place to know unless she wants you to know. But I would say to health professionals, medical learners, doctors, other health professionals, you don't need to know the intimate details of trauma that our people have experienced. What you need to know is that it happened and that your bedside manner is nuanced in that regard, so that when you're handling them, be aware of that. Know that we're still working through those issues, and we'll likely be working through those issues for a very long period of time, because time is the measure of us coming to terms with some of those issues. Because I don't know any other segment of Canadian society that are simultaneously trying to figure out the past and then try to find a way forward, right? So people like my mom, other Indigenous folks, First Nations folks who are in your care are carrying something. And if they're not carrying it directly, they're carrying stuff indirectly, because we've gone through hell and back as a result of this Canada's effort to terminate us. So, yeah, it's really important stuff. It doesn't have to equal love, but it certainly has to equal some semblance of synonym of love, right? If it's not love, then make it a synonym, right? Make it worthwhile. Make it worth the effort to know that this beautiful Indigenous person in front of you is carrying something, and that you're not completely aware of what it is. But we know enough now in this historical context to really think about the way we engage with our people in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you, Derek, for inviting your mom into this conversation as well. I think that's such an important insight. I agree that we must be aware of the fact that this trauma has occurred and people are still carrying it around. We don't need to know the nitty-gritty details. People will more than likely not wish to discuss it. If they do, then make that space. But be aware that it's there and act accordingly. And I think that's a really good segue into one of the other questions that I was hoping to discuss with you. Call to action number 22, which urges, quotes, those who can affect change within the Canadian healthcare system to recognize the value of healing practices of Indigenous peoples of Canada and to use them in their medical practices in collaboration, of course, with the experts, so your healers, your elders, et cetera. Do you have any tips for seeking out that knowledge in a context-specific way and collaborating with these experts in a good way?
Yeah, I think there needs to be and we've spent the last hour or so talking about this, but there's a need to continue the work to figure out how and why systems would consider including that knowledge within medicine. In our oldest known Nuu-chah-nulth stories, none of those stories say we came from someplace else. All of those stories say we come from right here. We don't come from any place else in the world than right here. And if you've ever been to the west coast of the island, it's not a matter of if our people ever broke bones or needed help bringing a child into the world or dealing with some kind of illness or emergency. It was just a matter of when. People broke a lot of bones. Breech births happen all of the time. So there's, in relation to geography, it created this very unique set of guidelines that where people were taught how to do those things. So there was a tutelage to offer in the way we lived our life that was, governed by a strong ethical background and force that only belonged to Nuu-chah-nulth people, and we made it uniquely ours. I think that's important to really get at the minutia of who Nuu-chah-nulth people are as compared to who Coast Salish people are, as compared to who Cree people are, Dene or Inuit people are. That it's all highly dependent on their geography and the unique features that created those things in the circumstances in which they needed medicine. What came along was this very aggressive onslaught of oppression and assimilation. And in this country of Canada, up until 1952, there was a piece of legislation under the Indian Act called the potlatch ban, which literally outlawed our culture and our ceremonies and the way we practiced medicine, particularly. That knowledge was suppressed. So we're just now seeing that knowledge come out into the light of day in our communities. There's a wonderful book by Dr. Paulette Steeves called The Indigenous Paleolithic of the Western Hemisphere. In her book, she references around anthropology, but you can apply it to medicine as well, that Western academic systems still have to figure out creating the spaces and opportunity where our knowledge is held up as legitimate and rightful, as opposed to it forever trying to be measured against some Western rigid academic sensibility, which is what most academic professionals still try to do. So I think we're a long way off that mark about bringing our medicine into these kinds of Western academic medicinal spaces. Because as we've described over the course of this conversation, systems are still adjusting to the way they do things, let alone how do we bring our own doctors into these spaces to do work. As an example, my dad had a stroke a couple years ago in Nanaimo. He got to the hospital in time and they were able to help him. But while he was in there, my dad likes to hear me sing our traditional songs, so I went to visit him, brought my drum. I started singing for him. And the entire room stopped. 3 or 4 nurses come running in. And it's just jarring kind of, what's he doing? Is he allowed to do that? Can he do that? How are we supposed to respond to that, right? So there was this interesting reaction of me singing to my dad because it makes him feel good. Well, if it makes him feel good, wouldn't that help him in the instance of a stroke? Wouldn't that make him feel better? As opposed to, well, we can't really allow you. It's going to be disturbing to others. I didn't ask because I knew what the reaction was going to be. Somebody would call somebody who would call somebody and go, no, can't really do that here, right? So I think we're a ways off thinking about those, but I think it shouldn't stop or limit us from including in creating the spaces for us to bring that knowledge into this kind of work, as opposed to, medicine historically from the early 1800s were highly reductionist in nature when it came to Indigenous people's knowledge about medicine, right? Because white people were the dominant race and we're smarter and we know better. So we also need to change that kind of highly institutional, highly Western academic didactic approach, because our people are entirely dependent on oral history. We come from oral culture. So those things were passed down over memory and strengthened by memory. So when you oppress it and stop it and make every effort to limit it, well, we surface as Indigenous people from that. So I think we're just now coming out of the shadows of that dark history and bringing that important knowledge into these kinds of spaces. But we need to be cognizant and mindful that if we want to learn, and a lot of people do, that we need to create the relevant space and opportunity for those expressions of knowledge to really flourish and breathe life into what already exists. Otherwise, if you approach it from a very institutional lens, you'll never get at what could be of great benefit to existing medical frameworks. Yeah.
Derek, that's so eloquently put. What I'm hearing is that, one, it's really important not to pan-Indigenize when it comes to this call to action. Two, it's very important to recognize that the use of traditional medicines survived an attempt on its erasure at the hands of the settler state. And so that knowledge is being revitalized and rediscovered. And three, the best thing that we can do as medical learners and these people who sort of are occupying the halls of the healthcare system is to make sure that that space is protected for the use of those healing techniques. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to really figure out the space and opportunity for Indigenous people to come into. At Cowichan Tribes, in front of the health center I worked at, there's a beautiful totem pole. My late Uncle Art carved it. And at the foundation of the pole is this beautiful frog, this big frog. And standing on the frog is a human figure, and the human figure is holding a salmon. And on the head of the human figure is this beautiful, massive Suhiltun mask. And the Suhiltun mask is the most important dance of the Cowichan Tribes people, of Coast Salish people generally. It's their highest performative, spiritual, ceremonial dance amongst Coast Salish people. But again, you could look at that pole for 100 years and never know that arguably the most important figure on that pole is the frog. And in accordance with how Cowichan Tribes practice their cultural and ceremonial work is done in the fall and particularly in the winter, they steal themselves away and they go and make very concerted efforts for their people to transform. into someone better, someone richer, someone stronger. And it's all in direct association to what they've learned from frogs. So I think frogs are the only animal in the world that can go simultaneously from water to air to land and thrive in each of those environments. So what an amazing thing that you have over a long period of time, people, Cowichan tribes people, Coast Salish people, observing those types of behaviors in a very deliberate way. And then sustaining that knowledge about the need to transform and the need to thrive and the need to uphold each other and to be healthy and to be good and to be generous. All of the principles that lay the foundation for that kind of life to exist. So there's a lot of richness that if you just are open to the possibility that there are other complex knowledge systems about medicine in the world only next door to you. And we've never asked them about that. We've never invited them to talk about that. So I think we're, again, just at the starting line to really create those spaces and opportunities for knowledge keepers in our community to come in and talk about how we can not only think about these frameworks, but maybe how do we start including them in the frameworks where we train medical doctors. Wouldn't that be an incredible thing?
That was my conversation with Derek Thompson, Director of Indigenous Engagement at the UBC Faculty of Medicine, on responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action as a medical learner. Let's go over a few of Derek's pearls. 1. Medical learners, and particularly non-Indigenous medical learners, have a role to play in realizing the 94 calls to action, and particularly those that pertain to health. 2. Indigenous people continue to face discrimination in the healthcare system and persistent inequities, and this is because they haven't been meaningfully included in many processes to reform the healthcare and public health systems. Recognize the value of Indigenous perspectives and seek to bring those perspectives into your teams through collaboration with Indigenous liaisons, elders, knowledge keepers, patient advocates, and others. 3. Apply trauma-informed principles to your interactions with Indigenous patients. As Derek says, you don't need to know the intimate details of the trauma that Indigenous patients have experienced. You just need to know that it happened and be mindful of it in your approach. We do well to take this lesson from the late Senator Murray Sinclair. In all of your encounters, deploy kindness, respect, and if not love, then something like it. 4. Recognize that other knowledge systems about medicine exist within the many different Indigenous communities in this country, and that they are just now being revitalized and rediscovered after surviving an attempt on their erasure through colonization. Honor these knowledge systems and the people doing the work of reviving them by making space for them within your workplaces. 5. Make an emotional commitment to knowledge and understanding. Read about Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada, their histories, and their present day. Avail yourself of opportunities to learn about cultural humility and safety within and outside the healthcare setting. Seek out discussions on these topics, even if you're not sure how they'll go. Make it a personal goal to better understand reconciliation and your place within it. Much gratitude to our guest, Derek Thompson. If you'd like to hear more from Derek or explore resources relevant to our conversation, check out the episode description and our Instagram posts on this episode. And thank you for listening to Just Medicine. I'm Sandra Smiley.